very much like to welcome Dr. Jessica Burkhart to my podcast, Lion Quirks, where I chat to lion people of all different, anything to do with lions. And here now we've got a wonderful opportunity to speak to an expert, a neuroscientist who works with lions. So I foresee us opening a really exciting and big door in this conversation in which we're going to discuss your PhD and your work. But for people who don't know you, I'd just like to start with a few questions, smaller questions. What your qualification is, where you got it, and in what?
Okay. So I've probably come around about a different way than most lion people. I am a neuroscientist, and people say, what is a neuroscientist doing working with lions? But I started with an undergraduate in neuroscience and cognitive science, always with an emphasis in behavior. And I worked from there in human neurology clinics, doing a lot of research in disease, a lot of neurodegenerative diseases. And I ended up doing my PhD co-advised between Neuroscience Department and EEB, which is Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. And I have since shifted from a lot of more neurophysiological and clinical work to a lot more behavioral work using the neuroscience perspective. And now I'm doing a project with the Center for Veterinary Wildlife Research, Paraclinical Sciences at the University of Pretoria. So adding in that veterinary work and looking at how we can understand behavior and help welfare from a neurological perspective.
That is a big commitment, like time-wise, money-wise, just a huge personal commitment. I'm very impressed.
It's taken about 20 years. Yeah.
Wow. And so as an American, what was the path towards lions? You say you didn't set out with lions in mind. It was this sort of circuitous path to get here. What brought you to lions?
Well, when I was young, I used to always want to understand animal emotions. And so in the beginning, it was always trying to understand cognitive processes. But then my father got really sick with ALS, which is a neurodegenerative disease. And so I kind of switched gears into more human-oriented research. And after he passed away, and then my mother also passed away shortly after, I kind of thought, life is short. And if mine was also going to end up being short, I wanted to do something meaningful. And for me, trying to help understand species and how species can persist in the changing environments with the world changing the way it is. And I decided to start thinking more along the lines of conservation work and how I can use my unique background and eclectic background to kind of understand helping different species. And it kind of started out evolving from basically lions have a really unique social structure. So they live in prides. Male lions actually form lifelong bonds with unrelated individuals, which is almost unheard of in the animal kingdom. They're considered one of the most highly social species, and their closest relative, the leopard, is completely solitary. So they'll often share a bit of territory overlap with their daughters, maybe share a carcass, but never at the same time. So they're considered extremely solitary. So you have these two really closely related cousins that are completely different in their social behavior, which is not very common. Usually animals who are closely related will have a very similar social behaviors, be on the same end of the sociality spectrum. And so for the neuroscience community, this is a really exciting comparative set of species because we actually started out doing a lot of neuroanatomical comparisons, looking under the microscopes, trying to see how the cellular architecture in the areas related to social behavior were different or the same in the social versus asocial species. And a lot of this work has been done in voles because voles are one of the only species that has a monogamous and then a polygamous version of closely related. So a lot of this work was previously done in voles, but lions and leopards added a new set of species that are advanced beyond the rodent that we can then investigate the differences in these social areas. And this early work was funded by Center for Academic Health for Autism Research and trying to understand how social networks in the brain develop and what areas we can target in order to impact behaviors. And so I just want to have a disclaimer that there's a wide spectrum of autism, and many high functioning people. It's a blessing to have these sort of it can create amazing talents for some people, but some people really struggle. And so for those people who struggle, a lot of them struggle socially. And in that context is where the research becomes important, is to try to help some of these people have a more comfortable life. And I say that as to not offend anybody who's dealing with autism, because there's a huge spectrum, and people come from many different places on that spectrum and backgrounds and all of this. However, that was where the original funding came from. But then when COVID hit, it really pushed back a lot of that research. The time that we had in the laboratory, the shipping the brains from Africa to America, and the permitting, all of those things were held back, which was actually a blessing for me, because I was able to transition more towards the behavioral research. Andy, am I staying on topic here?
You know, you went off question, but with fascinating answers. I'm going with you. I mean, I found you're just setting up all these more questions. I want to know all about the voles, but we don't really have time for voles. And also, so you were working on the brains. You said the brains were being shipped out to, brains were being shipped into America, and you were working on them in America, in the laboratories.
Correct. Yes. So the first part of my research was in the neuroscience department, and we were looking at, so oxytocin is this social molecule, and it's one of the neuropeptides that's highly responsible for social behavior. And so the density, so the number of receptors you have, also the distribution, so where those receptors are located in the brain, correlate with yours, a species' social behavior. And so we were really focusing on oxytocin, and then other molecules such as certain dopamines, and really just trying to get into the brain and see. We had 5 different regions that we had chose, and we were trying to do comparative studies. But again, that was put on hold for a while with COVID. So we haven't picked back up on the neuro side of it. And instead, I ended up pushing over to the behavioral side and using oxytocin intranasally in behavioral studies. And so that's where my research ended up going. And it's been really exciting, because now it opens a lot of doors for conservation.
In fact, when I first met you, you'd come to my sanctuary with Dr. Peter Caldwell on the night that I returned from Ukraine with 4 lions that we'd rescued out of Ukraine. And at dinner afterwards, you mentioned oxytocin, and I got a bit excited, because I'd never actually had a conversation, no opportunity to speak about oxytocin, whereas oxytocin had always been a fascination for me in the childbirth arena. So working in childbirth, it was something that fascinated me, and I used to sort of study and make notes about the effects on a woman, and also where something like adrenaline would come in and actually inhibit oxytocin, and then the effects thereof. So it was something I was quite fascinated about. And then you sat there and said that you were studying the neurological mechanisms modulating social behavior in big cats, and that you were running these behavioral studies, administering oxytocin intranasally during different social scenarios. And I was like, wow, this lady is fascinating. So I've been wanting to have this conversation with you. So first, I'm just going to interrupt and say, because I know the listeners are asking this question: how do you administer oxytocin intranasally to big cats?
Well, it's really interesting. I'll put it that way. So I have a perfume. Okay, first of all, most of the work that I've done for my studies, so to develop the protocol, test the dosage, has been in captive cats. And so luckily, people who have sanctuaries such as yours have been kind enough to understand the mission and let me come in. And there's no side effects, so it's not that it has been something hectic, but you basically have to habituate the animals. Most captive animals are used to taking meat from hands. so that they can take medications and whatnot on the other side of the fence, of course. And so what I did is I habituate myself to the animals in the studies, and then I hold the meat on a stick. I hold the stick with my foot against the gate, and I have, it looks like a perfume bottle that you're spraying. So I have to hold it like this while I hold the meat with my foot. And so while they're trying to pull the meat off the stick, I squirt them in the nose with the spray bottle. So sometimes the sound is a little bit disturbing for them because, most of our rescued animals have come from pretty traumatic situations. So there have been times when the sound is startling to them. But usually after the first time, by the second time, they don't even mind at all. Even within the third or fourth squirt, they're usually over it. Luckily, they're very meat motivated, right? So we can get the lions to take the oxytocin at the gate. So that has been the challenge, though, is the only way that the oxytocin can be absorbed to the brain is going up the nose. So as you were just talking about with oxytocin and in your experience being a midwife, right? And childbirth. So that you're dealing a lot with the peripheral effects of oxytocin, which most people know about. So that's smooth muscle contraction and all those things ready to push the baby out, which I can get a lot more into that as well if you'd like. But with the intranasal oxytocin, it's got those behavioral effects and it does not have the physical effect, which is why we have to get it up the nose.
Yeah, lots of questions now. Right. So behavioral effects. Okay, no wait. Let's go to. So two things. You're studying the behavioral effects. You already see behavior in the big cats. And then are you studying how the effect that the oxytocin will have on that behavior, like whether it's going to now influence allostasis or resilience, or are you studying them because you want a certain outcome? Like if you are using oxytocin for its behavioral outcomes, like that it's going to help with bonding, with social, with as humans will know it as the love or love hormone. Or are you doing both? You're doing it both ways.
Well, it's primarily okay. So oxytocin doesn't have intranasal oxytocin does not have reported side effects, and it's been tested across species. So the risk is very low. Anytime you're doing a study, you want to consider risk, right? So luckily, there wasn't a need to test like physical issues that may occur. Like polydipsia is one of the only things that has been recorded, which is excessive thirst. And that's very easy to control for. And we never, ever saw that. And I've given it to now over 200 lions, and that's never been an issue. So as far as side effects, and some people who know oxytocin may be thinking of the so-called dark side of oxytocin, but I'll get more into that. But so what we basically know about oxytocin is that it is one of the most highly conserved molecules across evolution, and it has very specific behavioral outputs. It is the chief social molecule, and we know that it has this effect across mammals. So in all mammals, we see this effect. We see this, that oxytocin impacts social behavior. However, as I mentioned before, with the density and distribution, there's a spectrum of behavior, solitary to social, but we do expect that oxytocin will have pro-social results. So in certain contexts, so disclaimer, and if people know about oxytocin work, in certain contexts, mostly in human beings, we have seen that oxytocin can enhance competition. And this is called the dark side of oxytocin, but this is mostly a byproduct of camaraderie within your group. You become more competitive against an out group. So this is where they say oxytocin can actually cause this antisocial effect, but it's actually almost a byproduct of this heightened sociality within a group. You get this behavior towards an out group. And this has been in humans, and humans have a much more developed cortex. So they our thought processes, our learned experiences are much more intricate. We're less primal. So we bring a lot more of emotion into these and, experience into these sort of cognitive processes. So that's something to understand. So I don't want to skim over that, because if anybody understands oxytocin, they'll be like, why didn't she mention that? So just to mention that. But it actually played into the work, because what I did was I wanted to understand, can oxytocin have a prosocial impact on lions, which you would expect. My general hypothesis is that lions are more social because they have more oxytocin receptors in the areas that are more important for governing social behavior. And so that was the original neuroanatomy, that we were looking at staining the receptors and comparing that to leopards. But now came the behavioral tests. If you squirt it in their nose, does it have an impact? And so because this had never been done, I did originally start with a really low dosage just to make sure we wouldn't see any of the peripheral effects, which is the smooth muscle contractions. If you inject it into a mother going into birth, that's Pitocin, is a synthetic form of oxytocin. It's what causes the labor contractions to start. Okay, I would like to say, when a mother gives birth, the baby is pressing. So oxytocin has peripheral effects and central, which is the brain. Peripheral is the body. So those peripheral effects of oxytocin are what start the contractions to push the baby out. While the baby is pressing out, okay, it presses on the G spot. And the G spot then releases a central release of oxytocin in the brain, which then causes this immediate emotional attachment to the baby. Okay, so you're getting the dual effect of peripheral muscle contraction and central social bonding with the mother-baby bond. And there's other things that go into play, breastfeeding and all of these things. But that's also why it's easy for women to get very attached during sex, is because that's the biological component of an orgasm, is that central release of oxytocin and this social bonding effect. And so you can see the difference of how oxytocin has the central effect and the peripheral effect. Okay, but we still had to test at a low dose to see, is there going to be a peripheral effect, even though in the literature, a peripheral effect is not found with intranasal administration. But I just started low just in case. In domestic dogs, they give up to 60 international units. That's 60. In a wiener dog, okay, I gave 10 to the lions. I said, let me just start really low. And I used the veterinary guidelines on how much you would actually inject to start contractions. And I made it below that amount. And we saw huge effects. So we saw huge behavioral effects with that tiny amount of intranasal oxytocin. Would you like me to describe the studies, or?
I would. Really would.
Okay. So the first study was looking at what social impacts does it have. And so a lot of the oxytocin literature previously was on in-group relationships. So relationships between members that know each other. And if they didn't know each other, then it was just individuals and not groups. So with lion prides, we had a unique opportunity to test within groups and group between groups. So the first part of the study was using a novel object, which is a play object. And lions have what's called the ownership rule. They become very possessive over an object or a carcass. Lions do not technically have dominance hierarchies. They're egalitarian, especially female lions, where it's an ownership rule, first come, first serve. It's not like hyenas. They were really difficult to test because when you put an object in there, the dominant will get it and the subordinates don't even have a chance. They'll stay far away. But in lions, it's first come, first serve, and they're constantly just waiting, but they respect the ownership level. So they will watch and be waiting because they also want a chance with the object. So it was a unique opportunity to look at this relationship and see, did they have more tolerance towards their neighbor and allowing them to come closer to the object with oxytocin? And did it increase their affiliative behaviors? And so We saw, yes, absolutely. So their body position to each other increased. They stayed in a closer proximity to each other, which means that they were more tolerant of each other. However, their distance from the object didn't change throughout studies. So that was important because it showed us that their interest in the object remained the same, but that they allowed each other to come closer and were willing to come closer to each other. And so that was really important for a base study to show that it increased tolerance and affiliative behavior. We did take a lot of other measurements, but lions are extremely lazy, as you know, Andy. And so it's really hard to get a statistically significant number of head rubs and all of those things because you would have to watch for days. And oxytocin only lasts for a few hours. But then, so that was really great. We saw that there was this in-group relationship that was impacted in a positive way. So then we wanted to test the out-group relationship. And it has been shown that oxytocin decreases vigilance in certain primates. So we wanted to know, and this was the really important part, will it decrease vigilance in African lions? And if so, how can that benefit us? And so we did the test and we're okay. In the Serengeti, if you want to do a population analysis, you will play a speaker on the back of a bucky or a truck, and all the lions will come running out to see who's intruding in their territory. And that's how they do population analysis. They count how many lions come running out, and that gives them a pretty good idea. So we mimic this sort of study. We play an intruder. So we play a loudspeaker of a roar from an individual from the Serengeti who they're not familiar with. And the lions come running forward in their enclosure. They're scent marking, they're roaring in response, and they're pacing back and forth, and they're responding to the intruder. And we did a baseline study where we gave them nothing. We did the oxytocin, and then we did a saline where we spray them with a salt solution so that you can make sure their behavior isn't just because they're irritated that they got sprayed with something, right? Or irritated of the researcher's presence, etc. So on the saline and baseline study during this intruder, they roared, they scent marked, they roared between the 15 lions, they roared between 40 and 60 times. On oxytocin, they roared zero.
Oh,
They were attentive. They watched like, hey, dude, but they just laid there. They were very chill. Almost no pacing, no scent marking. They were just curious, but were not vigilant. So it decreased these vigilant behaviors. Now, that's really an interesting finding that oxytocin had the ability to do this. Why is this important? So would you like me to go on and tell you why this is important?
yes, please.
Okay. So basically, you would never give this to lions in the wild and put them in a scenario where other lions are going to come attack them. Just to get that out of the way. A lot of people ask me that. No. Why this is useful is because in your sector of the industry, in sanctuaries, how often do you get lions that come from a solitary condition and they have gone through trauma, and now you have this solitary lion that is going to live alone for up to 20 years. And in prison, the worst punishment, one of the worst punishments, I don't know all the punishments in prison, but is solitary confinement. For a social species, solitary confinement is awful. And that's what we're doing to these lions who live in solitary conditions. However, they're extremely territorial and they have deathly weaponry. And they know that. Their mouths and their claws are deadly weaponry. So they're afraid of other individuals. They're territorial, so they protect their area. And it's not easy. And you can Google it. There's failures all the time where a lion kills another lion during a socialization. Because especially if they've been abused and they have past trauma, it's very hard because they're afraid. However, getting them a friend is the most important thing that we can do for them because sociality is the most important thing to a lion.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, they have to eat and sleep, but, as far as cognitive behavior, sociality is the most important. So this work enabled me to go into the second section of my study, which was to do socializations between animals and to do reconciliations between animals who have lived together but are now fighting and they're not getting along. And we've been able to rebond them and get them to get along again so they can stay together with a friend. And then bringing single animals together so that they don't have to live alone. So it's been really wonderful and exciting to be able to do this for the animals.
Yeah, well, from my side, I absolutely know what you're talking about. When we get them in, there's another whole conversation there to be had about why they are in the situation that they come in on their own, that people are keeping lions who are social, pride animals, separating them at birth, taking them away from their parents, what have you. So yeah, absolutely amazing that you can use that. And how's that going?
Yeah, it's going really well. I mean, I've socialized 37 animals, and other than having to be separated for health or because the sanctuary chose to for reasons that were outside of my control, all but one pair had a successful introduction. And the pair that didn't was PTSD, extreme PTSD that couldn't be overcome. And we all made the decision together that he was going to hurt somebody because he was too scared. So, but that's an innate, that's a deeply learned response with that innate fear and territorialism that just is a perfect storm. But other than that, 37, so it's been quite successful. And also I've used it for a lot of behavioral issues because it has anxiolytic effects, which means it decreases physiological and emotional anxiety. So you get this decreased feeling of anxiety and cortisol levels decrease. So you can use it to help animals who are afraid of, it's a social component, but if they're reacting negatively towards keepers or something in their social environment, I've used oxytocin to really help a lot of animals calm down, stop attacking fences, stop attacking keepers who are approaching. So they usually can, because they can hurt themselves when they attack the fence and the electric wiring and everything. So it's been really helping a lot. And so now we're actually going to start using it for translocation of rhinos for that anxiolytic effect and done cheetahs. And yeah, so I can talk a lot about that, but we'll focus on the lions for now.
Yeah. Well, I do have questions about if you've been using it with asocial cats as well. But with the lions, just to go back to what you've just said, you said that oxytocin, the effect would wear off after a few hours. So if you're doing it for behavioral issues, not just the bonding or socialization, which we'll get back to, but for behavioral issues, how often, how frequently, or is it something that a little bit every now and again will have the overall sort of training or effect that you want?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the oxytocin stays in the system based on saliva results for 4 to 6 hours. Some people say less, but what you have is it increases long-term potentiation, which is the connection to your prefrontal cortex. In other words, it's increasing learning. So if you've heard of use it or lose it, or neurons that fire together, wire together, it's like saying it's reinforcing these circuits to the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that is like cognition and reasoning. And so what's happening is if you give them the oxytocin, they have within that period of time. So I usually have like a really sweet spot of 45 minutes that I say after 45 minutes of administration, that 45 minutes after that, up to 90 minutes after administration is my really sweet spot where I give them enrichment, positive behavior. So I encourage this positivity. Not only are they feeling less afraid because it decreases amygdala function, it increases nucleus accumbens, which is like the jackpot of positive social reinforcement. And it's increasing that long-term potentiation to the prefrontal cortex. So you're learning that you felt less afraid and that you felt excited and good about it. So even after it wears off, you remember the positive experience. And so that's why, for conservation purposes, for example, I would only be able to give it one time because you don't want to habituate the animal to a human, obviously. But when they're anesthetized and move, give it to them when they wake up. Their first impression is positive. So even as the oxytocin wears off, they're going to still remember that first impression of their new social environment. Or during the transport, they're going to have less fear. So already when the oxytocin wears off, they're just still not afraid, right? So if what you expose them to in that time, they will learn that they don't feel as afraid and they feel more in tuned, basically. And so even one time can be really useful for the conservation work. But in captivity, we have the opportunity to do repeated doses and repeated therapy is what I would call it. So I basically take the animals every other day at first, and I give them oxytocin, and I bring them together, and I just give them all these good vibes. And then I wait until, then I start spreading out the oxytocin longer and longer until they go a week, 2 weeks without needing oxytocin, and they're just still showing all positive behaviors. So I had a pair of lions who the owners tried to put them next to each other, and the male ripped out the fence. They had to reinforce the fencing. He was going absolutely crazy trying to attack that female. He was afraid. He had only been with his mother since he was a baby, and this was the first other new animal he had been close to. He was afraid, and his fear-based reaction was aggression. And he was ripping the fence out. They had to reinforce it twice. And after oxytocin, by about the third dose, negative behavior completely subsided. And I'm talking, they were together for 2 months next to each other with no improvement. And by the first week of oxytocin, he had completely stopped with the negative behavior because he started realizing, he started getting that, let the fear go down and increase that positive feeling. And he started realizing, this is actually a positive thing. And so you get these scenarios like this where the intermittent, continued, repeated doses really are helpful in those animals who have more trauma and more fear, and we're able to do that in captivity.
That's amazing. I understand what you're saying. Wow. So when you're doing the socialization, you've now gone through this sort of process that you've just described. If there are behavioral issues, you've already been working with them, obviously, for some time before you would even get towards a potential bringing together of different lines. Now, that in itself is several things here. One is that it will be hugely circumstantial. It's going to be probably different depending, from my knowledge of lines, it will be different depending on the day even. Like you could be watching them for weeks and saying, yeah, this is looking good. I think we're going in the right direction. And then on the day, you could have a completely different set of lines. Do you find that the environment, the size of the area that they're in when you're doing it, the ability for them to move away or to hide behind structures or rocks or trees, or even the other people that are there, would you be quite strict on who is allowed to be around at the time? Because certainly my lions behave very differently if we have any strangers. And also, it could be someone they know well, but on that day, that person is feeling ill, that person's just had a fight with someone or whatever. We might not know, but they themselves are emitting different hormones, neuropeptides, whatever. They're coming along with their own cocktail of ingredients that they're bringing to the area. So you must be quite strict on what the circumstances are, and even then, probably don't know exactly what you're going to see on any given day.
Absolutely, Andy. I mean, you've done this yourself. And for me, because I work in multiple different sanctuaries, you guys are all set up differently. You all have, and at the end of the day, they're your animals. So, or under your care, I should say. And so the sanctuary manager would have the final say of whether so within my consultation, I will say this is my opinion, but my opinion can always be overridden by the owners of the animals who have ultimately known them longer, had other experiences. So for me, I don't always have the option of doing it exactly how I want to, but generally people, when they bring me in to do this, they'll listen to me. And so, yeah, I do prefer a bigger area because any animal who gets cornered, I always say there's two types of aggression. That's proactive and reactive. Now, proactive aggression is when you're planning on something and you're like stalking and waiting. Reactive aggression is when you get scared and you just react. And that is the most dangerous and unpredicted type of aggression. And that is what I have to really be careful of in these scenarios. Because, like you said, Andy, an animal can react completely differently on the day of. We don't know their histories often. They come from horrible conditions. We don't know how they've been treated. Yeah, we know it's usually bad, but we don't know what physical abuse they've had, and all, especially circus lions. And so they can act happy and, super cuddly at the fence line, but as soon as you remove that security and there's physical contact, you get this reactive aggression that can be deadly. And so therefore, we have to try to create a space for them that there's escape, that they can, because sometimes the reaction is just a split second, but if that other animal can't retreat or hide or get away, that is too late. And so, yes, we have to think of all the environmental factors, space, what's around, which gate we can open, how we can close and shift gates if we need to. We have a lot of things around to distract them if we see them getting, in that kind of, we say puffing up, like getting that, macho thing going. And then, as you've mentioned, I'm very strict about who's allowed to be there. As little as people as possible or necessary for the gate control, people that they know well. So I will always, before I even start socializing, I'll try to spend 4 to 5 days with the lion. Luckily, I have a pretty good blessed ability to bond with lions. And so usually 4 to 5 days is enough that I can get this relationship with them. And then throughout the socialization, but then it's only usually the manager and maybe one other person who's got fire hydrant, and sometimes a veterinarian who's hiding because we don't, who's set back so that they're not disturbing, but they're there if we need them. Yeah, so you do really have to be really careful in the event of actually opening gates between these deadly carnivores, right?
It's a huge responsibility because, a mistake can be fatal. So to get to that point that, I mean, if for me, I'm only working with the cats that I know and I'm responsible for. But if you're working for cats that are in all these different sanctuaries and you're working with teams and people that are expecting stuff, I can imagine that it is a big responsibility that you carry on your shoulders.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. I think part of the benefit of my neuroscience background, and it's just, it's a little different perspective on behavior and watching the physiological signs, and even in their eyes. I mean, eyes are the window. You can see so much. And people might look at a lion and go, how can you tell? We see these pictures of lions roaring all the time when really they're yawning. People don't know how to read facial expressions. But, it's like we read their facial expressions. So, yeah, and it is really challenging to deal with different people. I think we're all a bunch of cat ladies, and so we're all a little difficult in our own ways, We're just big cat ladies. So, yeah. So, but, in the end, we all have the animal's best interest in heart, and we all understand that you cannot predict it. In fact, the better you know animals, the more you realize that you cannot predict them, right?
Yeah. And I think most of our listeners who are also cat people will know that cats, even your domestic cats at home, that most people would be familiar with. That they're moody, they're changeable, they do things at their own time, their own discretion. They're not going to do something just because you come along and say, right, we're ready. It's time. So with socialization, have you had situations where you've socialized more than two previous strangers but like 3, 4 that have come from different places? Or have you ever done it that you've socialized 2 and then later on added a third?
So the majority of group socializations, see, the thing is in captivity, having a stable pair of animals is a really great thing that we want. So a lot of times adding a third member to a stable pair creates instability. And so a lot of times it's not really the best goal. And there's so many single animals that we try to just pair up all the singles that we can. I think that's the primary focus. However, I have on a few occasions introduced a male lion to a pair of females. Sometimes it has gone well, sometimes it has not gone as well. But males are really generally they're difficult. They're very testosteronic and like they own the place, and so when you have a stable pair of females, and females are badass. So when you put this kind of testosteronic energy in, the females can really create a whirlwind. And so it's not as easy. I did have a pair of females that we introduced with a male, and things were going well until suddenly the one female started acting really weird. And I said, she's not okay. Something's wrong with her. And then we checked her, and sure enough, she had come down with cancer. So we decided to separate them because she had got really weak and vulnerable. And it was very shortly after the socialization. But that's another thing. I generally have the animals health checked beforehand because you want to make sure that there aren't any underlying health issues that we don't see, because the lions will pick up on that. And, they will pick on the unhealthy ones, especially if they don't have a long, if they have a long relationship, it's different. But if it's a new animal, they will pick up on those things, and it can be dangerous. So, and then I've had some younger animals that were a lot easier to put together. So I have a group of 9 that are together right now, which came in pairs and got them all together, but they're all about 2 and under. So that, of course, is much easier. I mean, they're still fierce and ferocious, don't get me wrong, but the younger ones are much easier. But I think in the older animals, it can just be very stressful to try to create a group. And that hasn't generally been the preference in captivity, especially because then you need a larger enclosure and all of those things. So we also had one other group where the male was just a wimp. And we actually introduced him to his 2 sisters, but we don't think he had actually ever been with them. But they came from the circus. And those sisters just kept picking on him so much that he just laid there like this. Like he was so unhappy with them. And so after a couple days, I thought we should have just kept going and it would get better. But the owners respectfully said, he just looks really unhappy, so we want to stop. And so that was okay. Nothing, no injuries or anything occurred. It's just the male was really not, not loving it. So sometimes it takes time, and but groups are definitely harder for sure.
I have 3 lions that I moved from one enclosure up to another enclosure last week. Now, these lions are 13 years old next month. They are 2 siblings and another lioness, but they've been together since the first day of their lives. So nearly 13 years. But when I move them, the more dominant female, she is, when they're all awake and fine, she is the more dominant female. She's the cleverest. She's the most agile, physically strong. It's a male and 2 females. Rain is the more dominant one. But whenever they're sedated or like this on moving, I actually get the other 2 asleep first and then Rain. And then also on putting them in their new enclosure, put Rain into the management area and the male and the other female into the main enclosure, because the male and female who are less dominant when they're awake will go immediately and take this opportunity. They're like, oh, Rain's sleeping, or Rain, and they go and they start picking on her, but really violently picking on her. And I've also seen it when there was a time a few months ago when they were doing that, and that's what alerted me to the fact that there was something wrong with Rain. Rain had, and I called the vet, and we had to actually find out what illness Rain had. But these lions have been together their entire life, from the day they were born, nearly 13 years, yet still you will have these issues. And I mean, because these guys have been together forever, I don't then also sit with oh, have I misplaced? Have I done something wrong by putting together lions who later on end up turning on one another? But if you're in the situation that you've actually bonded lions, there's always going to be that little thing that sits with you, like, did you make a mistake? Did you cause this?
Well, and just like humans, personalities develop over time as well, you know? And I think we
Yeah.
all learned in COVID. We all learned in COVID that even if you love your family, being stuck in a house with them for a year is really hard. So you imagine these animals that would normally have these huge territories and they're stuck in these tiny areas. And so I actually just have an article up for publication right now that I studied dominance and how dominance has developed. And this is in captivity, because we don't see dominance in lions in the wild, but in captivity, we absolutely see it. And you can see for Rain, that's a coping mechanism for dealing with, you know, this kind of captive environment where she's unable to disperse.
Yeah. So that is actually one of the questions I had, was what difference you see in captive lions compared to wild lions with regards to this behavior. All my experiences with captive lions. So when you talk about them being egalitarian, you know, I do see hierarchy, very much so, in the situation. But now I'm understanding it. It's because they're in this situation. And I mean, the males wouldn't be living permanently with the females at all. We've completely taken them outside of their natural, the progression of the males moving off at a certain age and also only coming back, you know, at certain times. And when we put them together, and I don't know about you, but in my situation, I've quite often had bonding a male and female, not because I set out to bond male and female. A lot of humans like to put this sort of human angle onto things, and they're always like, yeah, you know, that male and female are now a couple, or they're in love, or you're bonding like male female because of this little romantic story. There is nothing like that with lions. The males wouldn't be with a female, and we don't set out to do it. But it just so happens that we have got quite a few male female pairs because of how they came into the sanctuary. And if they're alone, then we want to bond them, you know. And our females, disclaimer here as well, that every female is spayed. Putting male female together does not result in, no sanctuary would ever be breeding. But that's very interesting.
Absolutely.
In the wild, that they don't have that same sort of hierarchy.
Yeah, it's really difficult. Like you say, Andy, most of the pairs that you see are either litter mates that grew up together, or if they've been socialized, it's generally a male-female pair. It just feels more natural. And, you know, I think as an adult lion, the only time okay, let me just say, for the females bond with sisters and children, and males will come in to breed. And every 4 years or so, those males will get kicked out and new males will come in. But the pride is actually the females, right? So the females have these really tight-knit units. And in the wild, it's almost unheard of that unrelated females will bond. And so my boss, my advisor for my PhD is Craig Packer. He's like the world expert lion researcher. And he just wrote a book. And out of about 1,000 females in the Serengeti, there were less than 10 that ever, I think it was 4 that ever pairs of females. And it was only because of very strict, dire circumstances. So in the wild, females do not come together ever. Like, you can almost say ever, unless extenuating circumstances. So in captivity, we sometimes see females who are housed next to each other that lie at the fence together and seem to enjoy each other. But to actually think of opening for them, that is extremely unnatural, because females in the wild would never come together, right? So unless they were little babies and you put them together as babies, great. But as adults, I think a lot of people are hesitant because it's unnatural. Okay, not to say anything in captivity is natural. But the other thing, in the wild, males will bond with unrelated males. So the males get kicked out when they're about 4 years old, and they go out with their litter mates, or if they have no litter mates, either way, they form these coalitions with similar age and status, health, level males. And they're very selective, but then they'll form these coalitions and they will stay bonded with that group for the rest of their life. They'll take over prides, they'll get kicked out together, they'll take over another pride together. Eventually, when they're old, they'll live together as a group of males, and they're called the coalitions. And so naturally, and in captivity, I don't know how many pairs of males. I know I've seen you do have a pair of males, but the males are generally the best captive pair. The two males together are constantly rolling on each other, loving each other. Yeah, they'll smack the crap out of each other too, but males are very affiliative with each other. Females also love each other, but it's almost not to the extent that the males do. They're just so bonded. But in captivity, males are much more aggressive. Like, females can be aggressive, but males are, okay, how do I say this? My opinion is males are not as intelligent and they're more reactive. Okay, I don't have a test showing that males are less intelligent, but that's my overall feeling in working with them and doing socialization. Males are much more reactive and they're not actually processing the next step. They're kind of just going with what's right in front of them. That's why putting two males together in captivity is really scary. It's much more risky to try to do that, right? It just feels more scary because they're bigger, their teeth are bigger, their claws are bigger, they're more apt to fight. Females defend themselves, but when a female comes up against a scary situation, they will smack, but a lot of times they'll submit. They put their heads down, they submit. That makes the male decide to back off. Males don't typically submit. Males typically puff up and start coming in. So, if you think about it, in the wild, males, when they meet, they fight for territory. They fight for females. So a male's go-to is never to be submissive. It's to, okay, this is it, and they fight. So it's a lot scarier, I think, to put males together. And the only males I've put together were the young ones. I had a pair I was working on, and then one also got cancer and he got too sick before we got far enough into it. But I think it's just generally more scary,
I've got two males that I put together. They were 6 and 7 years old when I did. They had, and the reason I'm mentioning them is what you said about them being absolutely the most loving pair that of every single line at Love Lions Live Sanctuary, Bo and Ty are the most loving pair. But it did take me a very long time. Like, they were in an enclosure next to each other, and it took a long time of seeing that Bo really wanted to be with Ty. Now, Bo came from a breeding place where he was with a lot of males. So Bo was accustomed to having already been, I think there were 18 males in the camp that he was in when he was rescued out of there. So he was used to it, but Ty wasn't. Ty was a solitary guy. And I first initially bonded Ty with a female, and I wanted it so badly to work, and it didn't. He kept beating up the female Mela, and it eventually, for Mela's sake, for survival reasons, I actually had to separate them and move Mela out. And she's now, in the end of the day, with another lion, another male, Carl. But Ty just was always alone. He was a solitary guy, and the two of them both started showing that he wanted to be with Ty. But ultimately, the entire process took me just over a year to actually get them together. We built a second enclosure between the two, and then we'd cycle them through there. We'd put the middle enclosure was called Camp 2, and then they were each in 1 and 3. So we'd allow each one to have time in Camp 2, then back into their enclosure, then into Camp 2. So Camp 2 became sort of common territory. They both knew it. And we did that for 14 months, the cycling of them through that middle camp. And then we had all 3 camps open to them when we did the actual introduction. Did it very carefully. We were absolutely sure. And then we had the vet hiding in the background, because you can't bring the vet in. The lions will behave differently if the vet's there. And we've also got meat hiding in the background, but you can't bring the meat in because the lions are going to behave entirely differently if there's meat in the picture. But you've got meat in case you need to bribe them, to move them into a safe area. But yeah, I digress. Before we move on, I want to tell you, I look forward to reading that. I'd love to read your paper that you say that you're ready to publish. I look forward to reading that at some point.
Yeah, I'll absolutely send it to you. Yeah, that's exciting though, Andy. And that's the best thing you can do too, is rotate them territory so that they are having a common area that they're coming into. It's so important for them to get used to each other's scent and to realize that they're going to be sharing a space.
Yeah. And they've had
Well
happy
done.
times there as well. They've eaten their food in there. They've sprayed, they've marked the place, they've weed and pooed and slept and done all their things, sprayed on the leaves, and yeah, done that for 14 months before we eventually got to the point of moving them. And then also when I've done any introductions, I always do it with nobody, either just one person, Elena, who used to work with me, or with the latest one that I did, which was little Nahara with Mbali. On the day that I actually put them together, I was alone because I kept seeing that other people showing fear or getting upset was really affecting the lions. And so it took a moment, a day when I was alone, and I could actually just say, I'm going to work through this. We're going to work through this. And I would give them distractions. I used water spray over the fence that they're jumping, catching the water. I gave them pumpkins. I just kept on giving them things. But by that stage, when you get to the point that you're actually letting them be together, even if it's just for a play date, obviously you've already really, really ascertained that you feel this is most likely, I can't say ever that it's 100%, but you're really sure that it's going to be as safe as possible for the lions.
Absolutely. And one thing for me with the study was we had to pick a timeline. And so we tried to stay competitive with current practices, which is to use tranquilizers or SSRIs like Prozac, fluoxetine. And those things can take up to 6 months to taper on and off. But generally, the goal is 8 weeks. So we try to keep a socialization from the day oxytocin starts until the day the gate is open to stay under 8 weeks is the goal. And mostly they have all gone, some after 3 weeks of the oxytocin. You see such a big difference. You're ready. But yeah, so you can see how the oxytocin can kind of catalyze the process. But definitely, if at 8 weeks I didn't feel comfortable, I would absolutely not chance it just for the sake of protocol, right? Yeah.
And so with fluoxetine, then that would be that you put them all on the fluoxetine, or you put them all on them and then keep them on it for a long period of time. I mean,
fluoxetine is not a good solution. That's why I'm developing a new protocol. Fluoxetine, putting an animal on a neuromodulator that's long-term, that has side effects, that takes tapering on and off, it's expensive. Why? That's really, I'm giving them a hormone. It's very mild. There's no side effects. So yes, we're impacting their neurological perception and their cognitive process, but it's very temporary and it's in a very natural way. It's in enhancing the natural way. Fluoxetine is blocking your reuptake of the serotonin. So it actually affects your brain's ability to produce it after long term. And you should, in developing animals and everything, it creates serious challenges. So unless an animal has serious issues, then I'm never really a fan of fluoxetine. I would definitely try behavioral habituation and techniques such as that before fluoxetine. But in some cases, animals need it. And so I'm not saying it's always a bad thing. But yeah, for a socialization, it's definitely not the ideal. But that's been one of the go-tos because that's all they had,
Have you found or noticed that that there's age-related behavioral things? Like with the males, I really don't know if there's any studies or there's anything behind this. Just from my sort of empirical point of view, just noticing there's sort of a trend that the males, when they get to a certain age, say around about 3 years old or whatever, when they would have been leaving their pride, the natal pride, at that age, there often is a little bit of behavioral issues. They start becoming quite bratty and snappy and not very nice to their litter mates if they're still living with their litter mates, which in Sanctuary, if they came into Sanctuary with litter mates, then they are. So in the wild, those males now would have moved off and gone and become nomadic, walked around. And yet now we've got them jailed in behind fences. And then again, there's another time that I see a few years later, which would possibly correlate with the age that the lions would be in the wild when they now would be ousted from their new pride, or actually, no, there's also another stage here where they would actually be at that age when they now want to go and seek a pride. So they've been nomadic, they've been walking around for a few years, and then they have this sort of spike potentially in testosterone that says, I want to now go and mate, I want a pride, and they're willing to fight to get into a pride. Now you've got those same lions just stuck with the same group that they've been with their whole life, yet there still seems to be this behavior in my experience that comes out.
Absolutely. And then I think the other age is around 13 or so, especially in the males, you start to see this cognitive decline. And I think that's also difficult because they're not able to read social signals as well either at that point. And they go based more on innate behavior, which is aggression, and territorialism. And so I actually just found out about some research that was done that they found the cells that are involved with dementia in lions. And so it's actually really interesting because I've been saying this lion has early stage dementia, and I'm like, I can see it in his eyes and his behavior. And now they're saying they're finding it and they've actually identified the cells that are related to it. And I'm really excited for that work to come out. But yes, as far as the younger animals, it's so hectic. I mean, we had a group of 10 that I tried that it was, a dad and then layers and layers of females and their cubs we don't even know how they're all exactly related, but they ranged from age 11 till 6. And the dad was 11 and the two males were 6, and then the females in between. And those 6-year-old males within a year that's how old they were when we got them. And within a year, those males were really beating on their dad, and their dad had been diagnosed with a heart condition. So he was a little weak. And so it probably had to do with that. But then we would take them one by one. I would do these reconciliations, and one by one, they were great. They would cuddle, they would lay together. But whenever they were around the females, they would just start beating him up. So then we started rotating the males with the females so that they were never with the dad. But then they started picking on the females, and they just were beating everyone up no matter what we tried. But it's like that age. They just wanted, they would have left. They would have gone out.
Yeah.
They would have been taking over a new pride. And so we ended up separating them from the group. And now those two males are they were our most problematic set of animals. And now they're so happy. They love it, their enrichment. They roll around together. They're not problematic at all. It's just those group dynamics. They know they're supposed to leave. The females naturally want to push them out. So yeah, you're right. Those time periods are really hard to deal with in captivity. And sometimes there's a way if we can just get through it. But sometimes the best thing to do is to separate them. And hopefully it's not one individual that you're taking out. Hopefully you can still have them with another individual. But that's the sad truth about captivity, right?
Yeah. Well, they're in such unnatural conditions. But you pointing out having noticed dementia in lions, I completely get that. And I want to ask you, have you ever noticed, because I once had a lioness who I completely felt just using, my human feelings about things and putting potentially a human judgment on this, but I felt like she was autistic. I used to say, if there is such a thing as an autistic lion, Siva is autistic. Could there be such a thing?
I mean, if you think of autism and the fact that it's such a spectrum, and that even areas of autism that were defined are now undefined. And so I think, and I'm going to make a leap here, and I'm not making a direct connection because, again, I don't want to offend anybody. But I would say for me, some of those cognitive issues that we would maybe put a label on could be from the breeding, the quality of breeding, the level of inbreeding. And this is why I'm saying I'm not relating it to autism, but I am saying that when you get an animal who's not functioning normally, we're talking about animals, we're not talking about humans who have advanced, cognition. But when you get these animals who are not functioning normally, if I can just say it that way, I think a lot of it can have to do with inbreeding. And, we see, because there is a lot of inbreeding in captive animals. We know that. And we also see that inbreeding causes not only physical defects, but also neurological defects and cognitive issues. And so you do get these weird, cognitive behaviors that are, likely, yes. So I would say there are some form of those sort of things Also, one time I was in a Instagram post or something, TikTok or something, and I said, "Ew, my lion, look at her with her ADD." And somebody freaked out on me and said, who are you to say this lion has ADD? And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm a neurobehaviorist with a PhD in neuroscience and big cats. So if anyone can say it, it's me. But but it was a joke. But also, being sensitive to human conditions. But animals do have ADD, and animals do have, a, a brain is a brain in those kind of respects, that there can be issues and functional connectivity situations that cause, definite behavioral scenarios for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, with little Siva, she was one of four. So she had three sisters. We called them the S girls, and they each had a name beginning with S. But Siva, so my reaction to her was to kind of protect her, but I could see that she didn't like the same stimuli as the others, that she was overwhelmed often. So I just gave her more of what I felt that she needed, and sort of protected her a little bit from the world.
Is she still alive?
No, the place that she was at, I left and later found out that they'd returned to breeding, and they actually bred with her. And she was also physically a little bit compromised, but they actually forced her to breed, and she died whilst giving birth. It was a very, very sad story, and it broke my heart. But there was a time when Siva was ill, when she was about a year old, that I actually went and slept with her in her enclosure for 5 nights to protect her from walking into the electric fence. She was too big to come out yet, and she'd had a little bit of poisoning, so her pupils were dilated, and she kept walking into the electric fence to try and get to me. And so I actually went in, which is not something that I do, and I've never done that in my sanctuary, I don't go into the enclosures. But with her, she kept on going into the fence, that there were other adult lions on the other side of that fence, and they were trying to grab at her and ripping at the fence. So the best way to keep, and there were no night rooms or management areas at that place. So I stayed with her in her enclosure for 5 days, just to sleep with her, to keep her from her sisters harming her and from her walking into the fence until she was better. So I had quite a strong bond with her. But I have no idea how she would have matured and grown up. Because she is no longer alive.
Well, so much to say about that, right, Andy? So first of all, great that you are observant enough to realize that she has the sensory sensitivities and everything. I mean, most people probably would never even take the time to notice that. So, and they all have different personalities and preferences, and it's so, these people, so just with that being said, it sounds like this place was not really caring much about the animals themselves. And so we can go on another 2 hours about the condition that lion breeding puts these animals in, and why we don't promote going in the enclosures, even though I always say, we've got these animals in captivity and we need to take care of them. And in that situation, that's what you had to do for the animal's best interest. And I'm glad you did, and I'm glad you would say it, because I think a lot of people aren't transparent about what's actually happening. And I think transparency is the best way to actually educate people and to let them understand why we do it and what we actually do,
Yeah. I'm very much at that point. It just struck me a few weeks ago, actually, that I was talking to somebody, they were here, and I have a lion who is grieving and is very depressed. And I said to them, please excuse me, but I can't stand here and not respond to my lion who's in need right now he's looking at me, he's calling out to me, and I need to give him the acknowledgement and recognition right at this moment. But please understand that this is not something that I encourage other people to do. And I need to try and explain that because I work with these lions every single day, and I am the caretaker, I'm the person who is responsible for this lion's well-being, mental and physical well-being. I can't not do what I need to do. It does not mean that I'm giving the okay for strangers to come in. And so I sort of used the analogy of an orphanage. If you were a person that was taking in orphan children, you're going to give them everything they need. It does not mean that someone off the street or some journalist or whoever can come in and do and just pick that child up or break through that barrier of trust that you have with the child. But it's difficult to explain. But at that moment, I had this sort of realization that came over me, that I think that being open and transparent about what we need to do to really truly give the animals the best that we can give them is going to be more of educational benefit than literally hiding behind what's politically correct.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had mentioned earlier solitary animals, which we didn't really get into. So I was going to say, well, based on what you're saying, lions are highly social. People they will create a bond with the people who are around them every day. And if you ignore that, that's actually not nice to the animal, And so people who say, oh, we let them live their most free life, I'm sorry, but in a 1 hectare enclosure or smaller, which is generally what it is, they're not living a free life. You're in their face all the time, and you might as well create a positive stimulation with them because they are confined to that. And that's how I feel. I think having a relationship with the animals that you work with, like you're saying, though, as their caretaker and as their handler, it's incredibly important, especially if that animal gets sick, if they're unwell and you need to give them medication and they've never had a relationship with you. Now they're afraid and they're scared and they're locked in a small enclosure and you're in their face trying to give them medication. That's so bad for them as a captive animal. So I find that having a relationship with captive animals is extremely important for their welfare. That is true. And anybody can argue that with me. But anyways, even the solitary animals, tigers also create this amazing, not to say they love it, but it is amazing the communication you can have with an animal. Even the tigers come up, they're chuffing, they're growling, they're wowing, they're momming. Like they also have a complete language and a communication. You know exactly what they want. They tell you what they want. And you have to be in tune to the animals who are in captivity to be able to care for them. So yeah, I think it's important to, like you said, educate people and be real about what's happening,
Yeah, I think caring about the animals more than caring about what people have to say. And then again, it's not that it happens all the time with all the animals. It's absolutely at that animal's discretion. The lion doesn't need to come anywhere. There's some lions that, like the guy that's depressed at the moment, he lost his sister and he's now alone. Having been with her his entire life, he now is alone. And he's reaching out, calls out, looks at me, his mouth, his face, his tongue, his everything is showing me the whole time, his vocalizations. And honestly, I have to put his needs ahead of people out there who are literally behind keyboards somewhere in a city. Which brings me just quickly to a comment that's been playing on my mind the whole time, is we never actually explained to the listeners that you are in South Africa working with these cats, because we started off talking about the fact that you were in America and you were doing lab work and it's being shipped over there. We never actually shifted people's set point that they understand that you are. So you've in South Africa, you've been here now for 4 more years, I think, and you're working with cats
here now.
I've lived
here for 7 days a week. I'm with the animals. I've lived here for 4 years. I've worked here for 7. So yeah, and to say tigers, a lot of the big cat sanctuaries also take in tigers because there's not a lot of space in the tigers' indigenous areas to create sanctuaries, and legislation is difficult in some of those areas. And also because in South Africa, there's a lot of tiger breeding as well. So that's why also, obviously lions in Africa, but then, we find ourselves with tigers and other big cats as well, because people are just doing it. But yeah, the oxytocin also works on solitary animals, to answer your question.
I was just about to ask you that.
Yeah.
I was just about to ask, what you said they have fewer receptors. Is that the difference?
That's my hypothesis is that in particular areas there would be fewer receptors. And you see in the voles, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll block the oxytocin receptors in particular areas or upregulate them in particular areas. And then that shows us how that impacts behavior. Because if you block the receptors, then the monogamous ones will, this is a crude explanation, but if you say block the receptors, the monogamous ones will become polygamous. And if you upregulate, then the polygamous ones become monogamous. And so you get this variation in behavior based on the distribution, however, and the density. But however, all mammals have oxytocin, and all mammals are cuddly. They breastfeed, they're, so yeah, we all have oxytocin, and still has a prosocial impact. And, tigers in captivity show less aberrant bad behaviors when paired with a friend. So even though they're considered solitary, in the wild, they raise babies for 2 years. The females, they have their babies for 2 years, kick them out, have more babies. So the females are always with babies, almost, and males are always seeking females. So they are always having social interaction. It's just that they're not social, that they live in groups. So they are happier based on their behavioral output in captivity when they are paired with another individual. It's not easy to socialize adults. With tigers, that's much more difficult. It can be done, but you also, if you Google it, will see a lot of deaths at zoos trying to do that, even male and female for breeding. But if you can keep litter mates together or something like this, it's always better for them too, They need contact. I mean, yeah, they need also communication, contact, stimulation.
We have two tigers. They came in together, and we were actually told by their previous owners that they're not getting on anymore and that we should potentially separate them. They're in their enclosure, which is, they have a hectare enclosure with quite a lot of forested areas. They're fine, but we cannot ever put them into the same management area. So we ended up having to build a second management area on the far side of their enclosure. So when we go into clean, we cannot put them in the same management area. And the funny thing is, our management area is the size of their full enclosure at the place that they came from. So they actually, male and female, were forced to live in sort of a 30 square meter camp prior to coming to us. But we were also told on getting 2 jaguars that came to us from the Bloemfontein Zoo, that a mother and daughter who had lived together their whole lives, that we need to separate them, that they're very, very aggressive, and that the mother is going to kill the daughter, which is not at all the case here, in that now they're happy. So now there is that, potentially naturally the flow of oxytocin has happened between these two, but they get on beautifully.
And if you want me to come help you with those 2 tigers, I would be happy to do that. It wouldn't hurt to give them a couple of squirts a couple days in a row and see if it can help them. I've definitely done reconciliation with tigers and made huge difference, from going from hissing and not coming within 5 meters of each other to best friends again. So just saying. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, if you want, then we can talk about it. It's like you said with those 3, the 2 females and the male, that when you move them and their behavior, sometimes just moving them to a different enclosure can make such a big difference, And so for those 2 jaguars to have a completely different environment, thankfully that made a difference for them. It's wonderful.
Yeah, well, just as their characters changed completely. When Dr. Peter would come here after a few months since he saw them from the zoo, he was like, "Oh, these are the same cats." They were hyper aggressive and freaked out, always defensive, vigilant, hyper vigilant in the zoo. So yeah, just putting them into an enclosure where they've now got water to swim in, and it's just a totally different story. They're in an absolutely different environment than being in a zoo, where they're also being on exhibition all the time with people. But yeah, I actually would like to speak to you again about the tigers. They get on fine when they're in the main enclosure. It's just trying to get them into the management so we can go in and clean. That even building a second management, I still struggle with getting them into management so that we can go in and do the necessary maintenance. So yeah, let's talk. But so Jessica, we need to start heading towards the end. What are your plans? You say you're busy doing this research for the Pretoria University. Is that what keeps you in South Africa? Or, once you finish with that, are you planning on staying? What's your plan?
Yeah, I love South Africa. I know the work could be very useful in zoos, but my heart is not there. I'm excited to get more involved in the conservation work and artificial group formation, bonding orphan baby rhinos into herds. And also this, all the reserves are fenced and animals can't rotate the way they would. So those male lions who normally would have left and found a new pride, they can't because they're in fenced reserves. And so the future of conservation really is this kind of artificial group formation where they say, okay, take 2 females from there, a male from there, and 1 from there, and throw them in this boma and hope it goes well. And it doesn't. I mean, there's varied success, but it's generally not going really well. So I would like to have some sort of rehabilitation center where I can kind of work in these artificial group formations, get the groups bonded, and then they can go to be released already bonded as a group. And, neurophysical rehabilitation, post-surgical rehabilitations, all these kind of things, captive and wild. So that would be my future. And I would, for now, plan on staying in South Africa. So if you know a husband for me, so I don't have to deal with this visa thing every 3 years, that would be great.
Yeah, that is an issue. But yeah, that's wonderful, because even when you're talking about the lions in the wild, pretty much we're talking about reserves, which means that they're still fenced in. They still don't have their absolute natural roaming grounds and territories. I look very forward to hearing more about your work and seeing you going on to working with the rhinos and all the different animals. I think that's wonderful. And it's lovely to have met you and to be able to chat to you. And I look forward to more conversations with you.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it.